The Year Before Samuel's Birth, Episode 19. Hello to all listeners of the Biblical Times podcast. The series of episodes we embark on is dedicated to the book of Samuel. Although the book is named after Samuel, who was a religious leader in Israel around 1070 BCE, it is actually a collection of many stories about numerous characters, characterized by emotional intensity. These characters rose to great heights and fell to the depths of depression, all living during one period in the history of Israel. The book includes the stories of Saul, the first king of Israel, and of David, the second king. It delves into the relationships between Saul and his children, Jonathan and Michal, as well as David's relationships with them, and introduces many other characters. As we always do, we will explain the stories we discuss in light of the historical, social, and legal realities that existed during the time when the heroes described in the book lived. We will also explain words that play an important role in Hebrew, the original language of the Bible, which have lost some of their meaning in the English translation. And after these words of introduction, we will set off. The book of Samuel opens with the story of the year before Samuel's birth. Here is the story in brief. Elkanah, Samuel's father, was married to two women. One was named Peninnah, and the other was Hannah. We have discussed why the Bible allows polygamy in episode 7, which was dedicated to the status of women in the Bible. Peninnah, as we know, had given Elkanah sons and daughters, while Hannah was barren. Every year, Elkanah and his family would travel to Shiloh, a small settlement located about 20 miles north of Jerusalem, to perform a religious ceremony, though the Bible doesn't reveal the exact nature of this ritual. The family visited Shiloh because it housed a sanctuary containing the Ark of the Covenant, which, according to the book of Deuteronomy chapter 18, held the tablets Moses received at Mount Sinai. This sanctuary was destroyed during Samuel's lifetime, but at the point of our story, it was one of the main worship centers for the tribes of Israel. About 100 years later, King Solomon built a large and magnificent temple in Jerusalem. Each year when Elkanah and his family arrived in Shiloh, they brought a goat or sheep that Elkanah sacrificed as part of the religious ceremony. A small piece was used for the ritual, and Elkanah would roast the rest of the meat and distribute portions to his family members. However, because he loved Hannah, he would give her a double portion. Quote, "Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her and the Lord had closed her womb." There's no doubt that Elkanah's great love for Hannah and his habit of giving her a double portion of meat aroused Peninnah's jealousy and anger. In revenge, she mocked Hannah for her barrenness, and the Bible describes the relationship between the two women as hostile. Today, jealousy over a portion of meat might seem petty, but in the context of the story's time, a double portion of meat was a big deal. In the ancient world, there were no dairy farms or supermarkets where you could buy meat, nor refrigerators to store meat for long periods. To prevent spoilage, meat had to be eaten on the same day. Usually, each family kept a few goats or sheep, which provided them with daily dairy products. But eating meat, which required slaughtering an animal, was reserved only for religious ceremonies or festive events. When we understand that Elkanah's family ate meat once or twice a year, maybe even 3 times, it's easy to see why Elkanah's habit of giving Hannah a double portion of meat angered Peninnah, and why this anger would erupt anew at each festive event. Quote, "This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat." Peninnah's mockery wasn't the only reason for Hannah's misery. Hannah believed that, for some unknown reason, God had punished her and prevented her from becoming a mother. Thus, she could not fulfill what was considered the primary duty of a woman in the ancient world toward her husband. We must explain why Hannah believed that God had punished her and prevented her from becoming a mother. This, of course, intensified Peninnah's mockery of her. Ancient peoples believed that their gods controlled fertility in the world. The Egyptians believed that their gods controlled the fertility of humans, domestic animals, and fields in Egypt. The Greeks, Chinese, and Indians believed that their gods controlled fertility in their countries. When the gods who lived in the heavens were pleased with the behavior of humans living on earth, they blessed them with years of abundance, prosperity, and fertility. Conversely, years of natural disasters, drought, and infertility were interpreted as punishment from the gods, who were angry with humans for some reason. The belief that years of fertility and abundance reflect God's satisfaction with the behavior of the Israelites, while years of natural disasters, plagues, and infertility demonstrate his anger, is repeated dozens of times in the Bible. Chapter 28 of the book of Deuteronomy provides the best example of this. The belief that God controls a woman's fertility is also found in the stories of Sarah and Rachel, as well as in the story of Leah, whom God blessed with many children. Like Hannah, Sarah, and Rachel believed that the reason for their prolonged years of barrenness was not due to any medical problem, but because God was punishing them. And when God forgave them, He opened their wombs and enabled them to conceive. Yet Hannah did something bold that no woman in the Bible had ever done. Hannah decided to persuade God to allow her to become a mother, and what she did is at the heart of the story. In the year this story takes place, after another big quarrel during which Peninnah ensured that Hannah would eat her double portion of meat along with many salty tears, Hannah entered the small temple in Shiloh and begged God to allow her to become pregnant. The Bible describes her prayer and her state of mind in these words. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly, and she made a vow, saying, "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." The bold act Hannah performed was making a vow to God during her prayer. A vow in the Bible is an oath with a heavy payment. The one making the vow commits in advance that if God grants his request, then in return, he will pay God the most precious thing he has, and this is exactly what Hannah did. The payment she committed to is divided into two parts. The simpler part says that if she has a child, his distinguishing mark will be that he will never have his hair cut or shaved, like Samson. No razor will ever be used on his head. The following words are the bold part of the payment Hannah committed to in her oath. Quote, "I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life." Hannah vowed that if she had a child, the child would not belong to her, but to God. The strong belief that she was punished by God was so terrible in her eyes that she gave up in advance on parenting the child she had hoped for and longed for many years, just so God would forgive her. For her, this was the most precious payment she could make. Now we must explain the boldness and danger that underlie the vow. The Bible takes very seriously the obligation of the one making an oath to God, and we learn this from the book of Deuteronomy, which says the following: "If you make a vow to the Lord your God, do not be slow to pay it, for the Lord your God will certainly demand it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. Whatever your lips utter, you must be sure to do, because you made your vow freely to the Lord your God with your own mouth." Chapter 30 of the book of Numbers adds to this severe warning, stating that if the one making the vow does not fulfill it, it will be interpreted as a crime against God, for which he will be punished with full severity. Nevertheless, the Bible distinguishes between a man's vow and a woman's vow. Here it's important to recall that the legal status of women in the ancient world, and almost until our days, was much lower than that of men, and therefore the Bible treats a woman's vow with some leniency. Chapter 30 of the book of Numbers deals in detail with women's oaths. According to the text, a woman might make a vow in a moment of haste. Due to a lack of judgment, she might obligate herself to a payment she cannot fulfill. If she is still a young woman living in her father's house, her father has the authority to cancel her vow only on that day. But if the father hears his daughter making a vow and does not immediately cancel it, his silence is interpreted as consent, and his daughter must execute her vow. This principle also applies to a married woman and explains what Hannah did. Here's an abbreviated quote from the book of Numbers. If a woman living with her husband makes a vow or obligates herself by a pledge under oath, and her husband hears about it but says nothing to her and does not forbid her, then all her vows or the pledges by which she obligated herself will stand. But if her husband nullifies them when he hears about it, then none of the vows or pledges that came from her lips will stand, and the Lord will release her. But if her husband says nothing to her about it, then he confirms all her vows or the pledges binding on her. he confirms them by saying nothing to her when he hears about them. While Hannah was immersed in prayer, an old priest named Eli, who was in charge of the temple in Shiloh, observed her closely. Eli noticed her strange behavior, and to his understanding, she was doing something strictly forbidden. He thought she was a drunk woman who had entered the temple, which angered him. He rebuked her and said, as she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine." To which Hannah replied, "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." The elderly priest understood his mistake and replied to her, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." After hearing the priest's words, Hannah's mood, who had been described throughout as a miserable and bitter woman, improved, and a year later, Samuel was born. Let's read and explain. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." The English translation of this quote is inaccurate. This inaccuracy stems from the limitations posed by literal translation from one language to another, which we have discussed before, and it appears again here. First, in Hebrew, the original language, Samuel was born exactly 1 year after the elderly priest promised Hannah that God would fulfill her request, not at some vague "in the course of time." The fact that Samuel was born a year later rules out the possibility that Hannah was already pregnant during the visit to Shiloh. The biggest loss in the English translation relates to Samuel's name. In English, the name Samuel is meaningless, but in Hebrew it's written as Shmuel, and the name Shmuel has several interpretations, all related to Hannah's vow. First, the name Shmuel consists of the root Sha-ma-el. The meaning of the word Shama is to hear or listen. El is one of God's names. Hence, an accurate interpretation of the name Shmuel is that God heard Hannah's prayer, exactly as the priest promised her. Another meaning of the name Shmuel is the combination of God's name in his name. El, as we said, is one of God's names. Shemo means his name. Combining these two words indicates that God's name is in Shmuel's name, teaching us that even before his birth, he was destined to be a prophet. Finally, in the name Shmuel, there's another root, Sha'al, which means to ask or to request, and this is the heart of the vow in which Hannah committed to return the child to God if he answered her prayer. It's important to emphasize here that Elkanah was entitled to cancel Hannah's vow on that day, as stated in the book of Numbers. But Elkanah shared the belief that his wife's barrenness was a punishment from heaven, and that the only way to enable her to become pregnant was to appease God and promise that the child would belong to him. And here we should add that if God rejects the vow, the payment is null and void. In the year Samuel was born, Hannah decided to stay at home and not join the annual journey to Shiloh until the baby was weaned. Elkanah agreed to her request, and when Samuel was weaned, she brought him to Shiloh. After the religious ceremony, they stood before Eli the priest, and Hannah said, "Pardon me, my lord. As surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him." And here's the part that shows Hannah fulfilled her commitment to God. "So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. Let's briefly summarize what we've discussed in this episode. Chapter 1 focuses on the year before Samuel's birth, and the central theme of the chapter is Hannah's strong belief that her prolonged barrenness was a punishment from God for an unknown reason. To be forgiven, she had to appease him, which explains the vow in which she was obligated to return the child to God, in the sense that he would grow up all his life in the temple in Shiloh, as indeed happened. As we demonstrated, the name Shmuel encapsulates the vow his mother made. From the following chapters, we know that little Samuel did grow up in Shiloh, and it was the elderly Eli who raised him, not his parents. We also know that in the following years, Hannah gave birth to 3 more sons and 2 daughters, and that Elkanah and his family continued to maintain the custom of coming to Shiloh to perform the annual ceremony, at which time Hannah would bring Samuel a coat she had made for him. Before we part, we'll tell you what we are going to talk about in the next episode, but first, we're asking for your support for our podcast. You can support Dr. Ravid, the content creator of this unique podcast, by visiting our website and donating through our Patreon or buying her a cup of coffee. Those interested in purchasing Dr. Ravid's book, Daily Life in Biblical Times, can do so through our podcast's website. The book examines the actions of biblical heroes, considering the social and legal norms that existed in their time and obligated them to act as they did. Dr. Ravid's book contains translations of numerous puns and word plays that offer additional insights into the stories, which are lost in the English translation. In the next episode, we'll talk about the day God first appeared to young Samuel and revealed to him that he was angry with Eli's 2 sons and intended to kill them. That's all for today. Please tell your friends and relatives about our podcast.